Okay, let's do a quick breakdown of this exact render right here. So I've done this kind of interior cave type thing so many times for the past few years. So in this one, I'll just show you the most efficient way that I've found to put this kind of scene together and make it look good. And everything is very, very simple in this one, so it should be fun, easy one to follow. Even though it looks like there's a lot of detail and complexity going on in here, especially when you look at the blend file. Like when you look at this, it's a bit crazy, but I promise I'll break this down in a way that's very simple and easy to understand. And when you see how simple this actually is, you're gonna see like this scene right here a little bit differently, maybe a lot differently. So the first thing I want to mention is these guys at the bottom. If you noticed in the render, there's these like skeleton guys. It's not making a huge difference to the render, and it's literally just a model that I bought from CG Trader. So I just went on the website CG Trader and then just typed in, like I searched for, I think this exact model is called Skeleton Zombie. So if you search for that, you'll probably find this exact one. But I'm not gonna do a tutorial on how to like buy a model. So all I did was just put that in here, put a texture on it, and then that was that. So not going to talk about that, but let's talk about the rest of the scene. So I think the number one thing that most people are going to be wondering about is these like rock formation type things on the side. I don't really know what you call this, but it kind of reminds me of like in Iceland, those, yeah, natural, weird hexagonal rock formations. It's kind of the vibe I was going for. But this basically is very easy to do, even though it looks kind of hard to make. It's very simple. So I just took one of these clusters of these things here, and I just moved it off to the side for this demonstration. So basically you can see what it is. I just separated a few of the individual pillars that I scattered on here. I separated them out into their individual things that I would have modeled. So the way you do this is you just model like 3 or 4 hexagonal shapes. You add a little bit of like damage or natural like variation, just so it's not so straight and like straight lines everywhere. If you really want to see exactly how you do this, I'll show you right now. As usual, it starts with, you know, a cube. So this kind of shape, maybe we'll add a loop cut right there. Take this edge, pull it out like this, and then take these edges, bring it in. You could also just add a cylinder with 5 or 6 segments, and there you go. And then, you know, you just, if you want to add some extra geometry and just mess with it like this, you can always do that and just kind of pull edges in and out here and there, bevel little things here and there. So apply the scale first, and then, you know, you can go in and bevel things. You can hit Control-Shift-B to bevel one vertice, and you just go in and make damage and just mess it up a little bit. Do that 3 or 4 times, and then you'll have a collection of just 3 or 4 different pillars. You just take those, add it to a collection, and then you can just use that to scatter onto some kind of object. If I go to top view here, you can see the kind of object that I would have scattered this on. It's, you know, it's very square here. So the way you would do this, I'm not going to show you exactly how to do this because there's so many tutorials going over how to like scatter an object onto another one. So you can use geometry nodes if you want. You know, probably all the introduction videos to geometry nodes that you'll see are how to scatter an object onto another object. So I think I've done a video on that too. If you look up one of my older videos of like, I think it's called Making Crazy Renders with Easy Geometry Nodes. You could also just use a particle system. So, you know, a hair particle system or even maybe an emitter particle system are going to work totally fine. Point is, you take something like this and you can see how it's going into like a vertical slope kind of shape like this. So you would just take some kind of sloping, elevating thing and then scatter these onto that. So that's all it is. And you can see that's the kind of shape it would have been scattered on. And you can see exactly that square that is showing up in there. You could, if you really want, you could literally just take this and press Alt-D a ton of times as well. Like take a bunch of clusters and just actually spam it around. That would work too, but it's just a bit faster to scatter it because there's like a few hundred of them. But you could honestly just take, sometimes I just do this, I'm really lazy. And the point is, however you want to get a cluster of things like this is going to work. Just get a cluster of them and then join them together. So I have just a thing here. If you're using a particle system or geonodes, you don't actually need to join them. You can just kind of, I join them here, but you don't need to. You can just use it as a cluster and just hit Shift-D and then duplicate that chunk around a bunch of times. So that's exactly what I did here. I just took that cluster of those pillars, duplicated it around a bunch of times. And if I click around here, now you'll start to see it's really not that much stuff happening. It's kind of the same one or two versions of those clusters flipped around a bunch of times, upside down, scaled vertically, like some of them are stretched out, some of them are stretched in, and you just do that. And that's how you get like a lot of variation in the, or seemingly a lot of variation in like the terrain or the clusters here. And so one other thing you'll notice is there's these models kind of intersecting that I just chucked in the sides here. And these are just rocks from Quixel Megascans. If we look at this in Material Preview, you can see it's just some rock from Quixel. So however you want to get rocks, if you want to use Quixel, or if you want to just go find some on some other website like CG Trader or something, it doesn't really matter. The point is, like, if you intersect real looking like photo scans of rocks inside of these models, it kind of gives it a much more natural look than if you just have it by itself. It kind of makes it feel like it's more part of the rock versus some separate like thing you modeled. It just gives it a more natural look. Oh, and I forgot to mention, texturing these is very easy. You just take, if you want this look, what I do is I just take a rock texture from Quixel. Again, you don't have to use Quixel, but any rock texture is going to work. Like, you can go on Ambient CG or textures.com, and you could just pick up, Ambient CG has 4K rock textures. You can just go there, grab one of those, throw it on here, and as long as it has a normal map that's decently detailed, that'll look totally fine in here. And so you can see that is just gonna, oops, that's displacement, my bad. The normal map is gonna be what's carrying a lot of that detail throughout the scene, and you can see what that's doing. I actually have it turned down quite a bit, but it's still on, and I guess the color and that's gonna add a bit of detail as well, or I guess a lot. So just pick a nice detailed rock texture and you throw that on there, and then maybe, since you have 3 or 4 versions of that pillar that you've made, you can just tweak the UV map a little bit so it's different spots on the texture. And then once you have a few of those, make a cluster however you want to do that, and then you're good to go. You got a big one of these, and you can use that to just throw around as a big chunk of stuff that will really easily fill up the scene very fast when you start duplicating that around. So that's exactly what I did here. And then, I just intersected that with a few other models to add some variation, spice it up a bit, like those rocks I showed you. And also some of these other pillars like this. That's just some random thing I made in kind of just intersecting in the wall there. And that's duplicated around a few times too. And that just gives it a more, like human-made vibe. I think I call this one Sanctuary something. So it's not like, you don't need to use these exact types of models, but the point is, like, if you just have it intersecting with something a bit more natural or some other type of pillars, that can give you a really cool look and a really complex look, and it makes people think, like, how the hell did you make that? When really it's just a few of the same, or even the one same chunk duplicated a ton of times with like some basic rocks chucked inside of it. So that should make a lot more sense now, looking at this, what's actually happening here. This thing I'll talk about now, but if you look at that, that's all it is. I'll talk about the water and the lighting in a second, but that's, most of it is just what I explained there, is that chunk duplicated a ton of times. Let's talk about this thing in the middle though, because this is kind of fun. I think I've done a video on using or creating like shattered things like this. I think it's called creating shattered crystals in Blender, if you want to find it on my channel. But this type of thing is very fun. You just take some kind of shape. I'll just do a quick demo right here. So cube, let's just add a loop cut there. Take this face, bring this up, scale it in, make some like Ethereum type shape, rotate it. And then all you do is you take the, you use cell fracture. And if you don't know what that is, I'll show you. It's object, quick effects, and then this one right here, cell fracture. I don't think that's an add-on you need to enable. If you do though, it comes with Blender. So you just go to edit preferences and search for it. But I'm pretty sure it just comes with Blender by default. You don't even need to turn anything on. But if you don't see it, just check the add-ons. But I'm pretty sure you don't need to do that. Anyways, if you click this, that will bring you into here. And I've explained this more in depth in another video I did, that other one, like creating shattered glowing crystals in Blender. But the settings I use is just noise up, so it's a bit more random. Recursion up. I'll just do 1 here because it's going to slow it down quite a lot. But if you do 2 or even 3, sometimes you can get really intricate results. And basically what this number does is it's just how many times will it divide the mesh into smaller and smaller pieces. So the higher that number, the more smaller shards you're going to get versus bigger chunks. So I'll show you here the difference between these two. But I'll turn it up to 1 for this one, but usually I think in the render I did 2. And then this setting right here, this other random factor, I'll just turn that up. I don't know exactly what that does, but more randomness seems better. And I'll just hit OK. And then it'll just run through the cell fracture and just do its thing. So you can see how it's dividing into big chunks, and then it's dividing those big chunks into smaller chunks. And so the higher that recursion is, it's going to divide those smaller chunks into even smaller chunks, and you'll get obviously slower, but sometimes more intricate and cooler results. And then you can see it's got the original mesh just over top of it. I'll usually just delete that because I don't need it. And then we can take all those individual pieces, and just because it's annoying to deal with so many separate objects at once, I'll take an empty like I've done here. So this square around it is just an empty that's all these pieces are parented to. So that means I can go in and move them around individually. But if I want to move everything at once, I can just move the empty or scale it if I want. And so that just makes it a lot easier to deal with. So let's just hit Shift A, empty, and then I'll just pick cube, but it doesn't matter which one you pick, but cube's gonna work here. Just put it roughly over this, and then just take all of this stuff. Make sure the empty is selected last, so it's the lighter selection, and then hit Control P for parent, and then Object Keep Transform, or just press K. And that will just make it so that when you move the empty around, all those pieces will follow, but you can still move them around individually on their own, which is super nice. And then to get it to kind of explode like this, you just take proportional editing. So you just click that circle button at the top right here. And then any of those pieces you grab, it will just have a fall off distance of all those other smaller chunks. So that's really nice to just kind of make it blow up a little bit. And you can turn on effect only locations and scale it if you want. And there's all sorts of fun stuff you can do. But that's how I did that. It's just a basic cell fracture, and then parent it to a thing, and you just move it around however you want. And yeah. So I'll just get rid of that for the demo, but that's exactly the same thing I did here. I just turned up the recursion a bit higher, I think. it was just 2. Okay, so that's that. And then for the texture, I think this is just, there's a lot of nonsense and complexity going on here, but basically what this is I took a rock texture from Quixel, and that's just the default rock texture, so it's carrying most of the detail. And again, you could get that from Ambient CG if you want. That's free. And that's just running into, we just got the basic base color. This is ambient occlusion, but it's not really doing that much. So this whole chain here is the base color. Got the roughness, normal, and displacement. So basic standard texture setup. And then there's some other, I put an ambient occlusion node in here. I think for this, in this case, all it's doing is just making everything a bit darker. Ambient occlusion is a separate thing on its own that doesn't just make it darker, but in this case, it's the way it's set up is it's kind of just making it darker in my case. So this whole chain here, just think of this as the base color chain. I'm doing some weird things, like I'm increasing saturation, I'm decreasing the brightness. There's some weird stuff going on. Not really that important. The basic idea is take a regular rock texture, put it on, and then you could stop there. But what's actually happening in mine is I'm adding a bit of translucency, so you can see if I just run this straight out without the translucent, it's just a regular like rock texture type thing, and you can see it's very solid looking. If I add that translucent in, which I'll explain in a second, it just gives it a nice soft, crystally salt type look, which I really like for this kind of stuff. So the way you do that is it's just so this is our basic texture running out of this one. So we've just got base color, roughness, and normal. And then that is just, like I showed you before, that can run straight out. But if you want that translucent, you just take a translucent node, run the base color that normally would be running into your regular texture, run that also into the translucent, and then run the translucent into an add shader and add those two things together. So you just add your regular texture to a translucent, and then make the translucent color the same color as the texture that's running into the principal shader. and then you just run the add shader out, and then there you go. You added translucency to it. That's what you just did. And then I've got just, yeah, that's it. So it looks complicated, but hopefully that explains it in a very simple way. There's all this extra stuff that you don't need to do, but that's what I explained is what's going on here for the most part. So that's that. And that, again, just gives it a cool, like, crystally kind of look, which is kind of fun sometimes. And I think I'm doing that to the rest of this stuff too. It just softens out everything and makes it look kind of cool and just, I don't know, like really soft stone, I guess. So just, you don't need to go for that look, but just kind of, I just thought it was cool in this one. So yeah, anyways, whoops. So yeah, anyways, looking around this scene now, it should make a lot more sense as to what is actually going on here, because there's nothing really that complicated in terms of what is going on in the viewport here. I guess I'll talk about the water in a second, but basically the floor here is just, I think I've got the same rock texture that's on everything. This one doesn't have the translucent, so it's just a regular rock texture. And then this floor here, it's just got adaptive subdivision. So you just make sure you're in experimental cycles, so you won't have this adaptive checkbox if you don't switch this feature set from supported to experimental. And then you just add a subdivision modifier, switch it over to adaptive right here. And then there you go. You could also just right click and subdivide it like 100 times and it would probably look the same, because it's underwater here. It's not really that important to have that on. Point is, have some rocks at the bottom, and then the water here. I've done a video on creating realistic water, so you can just go watch that if you've never done this before. But that's the node setup if you want to just copy it. So the different thing here that you probably haven't done before, if you haven't seen this, is these couple extra nodes, the light path, transparent, and mix shader. So that just lets, I'm not exactly sure exactly why this works, because has to do with I don't know, how the camera sees light rays in Blender, I guess, which I'm not really that good at understanding. But the point is, if you do this, it'll let a lot more light through the water versus if you just turn off the transmission normally. So it's just, that just makes it look a lot nicer. And then if you want it to be kind of a bit murky and cloudy, you just add a principled volume into the volume output of the same shader. And I'm adding a volume absorption, but it's not really doing anything. So just add this and run it straight out, and it'll look pretty much the same. Just make it whatever color you want, and then yeah, there you go. Again, that I go more in depth into that into my. I have another video about creating water, so you can watch that if you want. But I'd recommend just copying this setup here and just run with that. Okay, so that's the water. So yeah, let's talk about the lighting. As usual, I keep it very, very simple with the lighting. So in my scene here, I think this is a good example of a very simple setup. It's just one spotlight and pretty much nothing else. You can see there's still light in here. There is another area light at the bottom because I'm faking a bit of bounce lighting. So like the light that would be reflecting off the ground here and shining back up onto this model, I'm kind of enhancing that a little bit by adding an area light in those areas that it makes sense for light to be in. But for the most part, 99% of the light is coming from this one spotlight at the top. Like, I could delete these extra lights and it would look pretty much the same. But if I deleted this main spotlight, you can see there's almost no light left in the whole scene. So let's look at what this is. It's just a spotlight at the top of the scene shining through here. Yeah, whatever this number is, however many watts that is, it's turned up quite a bit. The radius is pretty high at 1 meter. So what that's doing is, if we look at the shadows here, so pay attention to the shadow being casted by these stones here. If I turn it down to 0, we're going to get really harsh shadows, and it almost looks like direct sunlight kind of. And so if I turn that up, the higher I turn that number, the softer that the shadows are going to be. So that just means that, like, in this render, I was kind of going for, you know, an underground type thing. So if you imagine, like, if you were in an underground type cave, what would the lighting look like if you were getting a bit of daylight? For me, I'm kind of picturing like, I don't know, like a cloudy day. If there was a big opening at the top of this cave, letting some light in, that's kind of what I was going for. So that's why the light size is turned up, because I don't want it to look like direct sunlight. I kind of want it to look like the light that you would see if you were at the bottom of a cave with just like the sky kind of reflecting in there, or shining in there rather. So, if you were in a cave, you probably wouldn't be getting direct sunlight. You'd probably just be getting a bit of ambient light from the sky. And that's kind of what I was trying to mimic here with the bigger radius. And it also just looks cool having nice soft shadows. The color here is just a little bit blue, so that's saturated at 0.17, so not anything crazy. You could have it at 0 and it would look almost the same, but I like it a little cool. And then, yeah, that's the lighting. Like, really not that complicated. So with this, I didn't just add it here and then it was perfect straight away. I had to move it around a few different times and try different angles and find a spot that worked best. And this is what I came up with. But so don't think that I just put it in here and it was done instantly. But just working with one light at a time means that it's going to be a lot easier to find the perfect spot for each light, versus like if you're struggling with the lighting, it might be because you have too many lights in your scene and it's just too hard to deal with that many lights at once. Because you gotta really find like the right spot for each light, and it's really hard to deal with that if there's a lot of lights. So that's why if you just add one single light and perfect the location and intensity and softness of that one light, then it's so much easier to deal with, and a lot of times it looks a lot better too. And then once you have one, if you need another one, you can add another one. But most of the time, like if I just add one, it's just one light that's doing all the heavy lifting in my scenes, and that just makes it look so much better most of the time, depending on what you're going for, obviously. Let's talk about the volumetrics here. So I've showed this pretty much in every single video because I use this in almost every render. It's just a cube over the whole scene. I've set it to display as bounds. So you just, on this cube here, you go to this orange square tab, scroll down to viewport display, and then there's this box right here, display as. So by default, it's on textured, so you can see it's just a regular cube. And then you just switch this over to bounds, and that's how you get this bounding box. So it's just out of the way, but it's still activated. And so what I've done is I just right-click this thing right here, and you just assign a shortcut to it, and then that way I made it D on the keyboard. So if I press D, that menu comes up, and I can just quickly switch to bounds right there, super fast. Here's the settings for the volume, just volume scatter, density at 0.005, pretty low. And then the anisotropy, it just means how the higher this number is, the more intense the fog is going to be closer to the light source. So if you turn it up way up high, you'll see here that like it gets really bright close to the light and really dim the farther away it gets from the light. But if I turn it downwards, more towards 0 or negative, it's going to get like just less intense close to the light source and just more dispersed kind of. And you can see what that's doing here. So yeah, that's the settings I was using for this one. That's my go-to setup is spotlight and volumetrics, and that looks good all the time. Not all the time, but like almost all the time. That's gonna look good. Okay, let's talk about the camera here, because this is an important thing to think about when you're creating a render. It's probably one of the most important things because it's how everyone else will actually see the thing that you've made. So the camera here, we've just set it to, I have it on panoramic, but it's not really doing that much. So if I switch it to perspective, there's the difference it made. Not a huge difference. It's basically just at 28 millimeters. So your default focal length, which is the zoom or the number of millimeters, that is going to be 50 millimeters. So when you create a new scene in Blender, your camera is by default set to 50 millimeters. If you open up your phone camera, like the regular back main camera on your phone, that's going to be about 24 millimeters. So we're at 28 here, so it's just a little bit more zoomed in than what that would be, if that gives you an idea of how zoomed in that is. So if you've never used a camera, that should make more sense. But if you have used a camera, you'll already know all that stuff. But anyways, that's what I'm doing here. And then I did just switch it to panoramic, and that's distorting it a little bit. I have a whole video on, I keep saying that, but I do have a whole video on using this fisheye lens here. But basically you just switch this camera, switch it to panoramic, and then switch the type here over to fisheye lens polynomial. And then there's all these numbers here. K1 is basically your focal length in and out, and then K2 is basically the amount of distortion around the edge. And then all the other numbers I usually don't touch. So if you just want a tiny bit of distortion around the edge, just to curve the edges a little bit, that looks really nice sometimes. And that's what I did here, is just add a little bit of that. So you can see, again, there's perspective, perfectly straight. Panoramic just warps it a little bit. Just fun to do sometimes. Not necessary, but just fun to do. And I think that's everything. Like this is not a very complicated scene. It's all just basic stuff. But the important thing is it's all laid out and placed in a way that fits nicely together. And really that was the challenge of this scene, was just fitting all these simple elements together in a way that looked good. And all I can say for that is it's just trial and error. Like it's just, you just do this thing a ton of times, and then you'll figure out what looks good and what doesn't look good. And it's so there's the long-term trial and error, but there's also just the trial and error of every single time I create a new render. It's like I don't know exactly where things should be, and the color, and like how bright the light should be, and how far the camera away should be. Like I have to figure it out every single time I start a new render. So it's like that's just part of the process. So yeah, there you go. I think that's all I need to say for this one. Like there's not much else in here. There's some weird stuff in the back that you can't even see, but that's there. Yeah. So hopefully that was useful, and it gives you some ideas of some like cave type things you could do. So go and try some, like, I don't know. You could go and make these like intricate pillar things if you want, or you could just use rocks only and not worry about that. But hopefully that gives you some ideas of like some renders you could try from this. And yeah. If you want to go really in depth into my environment creation process, and you want to see me make a bunch of environments from start to finish, like 0% start all the way through to 100% finished, and you also want a bunch of models that I use to make my artwork, there is a link in the description which will take you to a course page. You can go check that out if you want. If you don't want to spend money, that's probably not for you, but if you want to go really in depth, go check it out. So that's there. And yeah, hopefully this was useful, and I will see you around in some other video. And oh, one other thing is I'm using a new mic here, so sorry if there were some weird audio issues. I'll try and get that worked out for the next couple of videos. Anyways, that's it for this one. I'll see you in, I don't know, some other video. Bye.